He was never just a journalist. To me, when we were together, I was talking to a fellow freedom fighter.
This is the story of David Astor, legendary editor of The Observer from 1948 to 1975. It's the story of how his lifelong interest in South Africa had a dramatic impact on the lives of some of the key people involved in the struggle against apartheid, including Nelson Mandela, and had a crucial influence on how that country developed over the second half of the 20th century. This is what Nelson Mandela said on David Astor's death in 2001.
I'm not sure that it's understood in London, but The Observer, of all newspapers in the world, the masthead of The Observer is cherished in South Africa because under David's editorship, it was not only the first serious newspaper in the world to take Africa seriously, it was the first newspaper in the world to take Afrikaans seriously.
It was The Observer that saved the leadership of the African National Congress.
For David Astor, the cause of black Africans, and South Africans in particular, was an emotive one. It united the strands of anti-imperialism and political freedom that were most marked in his character. And as a liberal, he wanted to fight against prejudice, bigotry and segregation. In the years after 1948, when apartheid rule was formalised, Astor gathered together a collection of people who were to form the core of the early anti-apartheid movement in Britain, and the Observer offices were at its centre. But what was it that made Astor so interested in South Africa, and what made him pursue that interest for 50 years of his life?
My father talked a lot about his childhood and how it formed everything about him, in particular his political interests and attitudes. In 1931, when he was just 19, he went to Germany, looked at the political activities at the time, and he went to Communist Party gatherings and also to a Nazi Party rally, which made a very strong impression on him. He was sensitized to the beginnings of totalitarianism, oppressive regimes. And so as soon as Dr. Malan was elected, he immediately thought, this is bad news.
Daniel Francois Malan was elected South African Prime Minister in 1948 and introduced apartheid as an official policy of legal racial segregation. A whole raft of laws were introduced designed to advantage whites at every turn and disadvantage black South Africans. But Astor determined that he would fight apartheid through the pages of The Observer, and he set about putting together a team of like-minded reporters, activists and intellectuals. Central to the team that David Astor put together was Anthony Sampson. A young graduate from Oxford, Sampson went to South Africa in his early 20s in 1951. He forged incredible contacts with young men who would later become the leading figures in the African National Congress for a generation. These were men like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu. And it was this relentless weekly coverage highlighting the growing repression of the majority black South Africans that gave the paper a very special place in the hearts and minds of those fighting the regime in South Africa.
After Nazism and fascism and Stalinism, apartheid was the great issue of the 20th century.
The first editorials, the first leaders that were serious about Africa were in The Observer, written by David or Anthony. And then, of course, people like Oliver Tambo and others came to him.
Nelson Mandela said that he and Oliver Tambo thought, well, if they go and visit David Astor, at least they're likely to get a square meal, which shows how, dire their straits were.
David had taken him to the House of Lords, introduced him to a lot of politicians who he wouldn't otherwise have met. David's interest moved, I think, from sympathy and a feeling of injustice to active involvement. And of course, he had this magnificent vehicle of The Observer to make it count.
But the time when The Observer really played a crucial role was during what was called the Rivonia Trial. The trial took place in South Africa between 1963 and 1964, in which 10 leaders of the African National Congress were tried for 220 acts of sabotage designed to overthrow the apartheid system. And if found guilty, the accused faced the death penalty. Again, the Observer covered the trial obsessively and highlighted their case.
For 10 years after 1949, apartheid government was piling one race legislation after another. The only voice we heard clearly from London did not come from number 10 Downing Street. No, it came from the Observer.
All our legitimate newspapers were banned. We regarded the Observer as our mouthpiece, and the mouthpiece of those men who stood in the dock and had no voice at all.
Apartheid was about 12 years old. The government of the time felt pretty invincible and invulnerable, and they regarded these people as terrorists and communists, and so would have had no qualms about hanging them.
Their coverage was so sympathetic and exposed the brutality of apartheid and did not make our loved ones criminals.
We came to know that all is not lost, that in these very countries where the governments may be supporting or having a cozy relationship with apartheid, in fact there were organs of civil society that were sympathetic towards our struggle.
And so Nelson Mandela and the other activists in the Rivonia trial were spared the death penalty. Instead, they were given a life sentence and spent 27 years in prison. Most of that time they spent on Robben Island, a tiny little island just off the coast of Cape Town. David Astor never let up. In fact, if anything, he intensified his engagement, and he moved from being a sympathizer to being, in effect, an activist.
We did a lot of underground work together. For the first time, I found somebody who was able to assist me personally in assisting the prisoners on Robben Island.
Of course, we were not allowed newspapers for 16 years, and we were not allowed to talk about it in our letters or visits. But every now and then, news used to trickle in, smuggled newspapers, and when new prisoners joined us.
As they sat on Robben Island and they looked across the water at this city and the freedom of the city, you can imagine how dispirited they became from time to time. I mean, more than 20 years on that island. Both Mr. Mandela and his colleagues have said often that the fact that they were remembered in the Observer, that's the phrase that he used, we were remembered, that we were alive, kept them going.
I gave him a list of names, and then he arranged for British families to adopt certain prisoners on Robben Island, those who wanted to be educated. So the families abroad would send assistance direct to Robben Island.
Their letters were censored and so on. So my father was able to get these books to Mandela, and I know that it did mean a great deal to him.
Most of the prisoners who came out with degrees from Robben Island and from Victor Verster.
It wasn't until 1985, though, that David Astor eventually visited South Africa for himself. And it was then that Sean Johnson, who arranged the trip and accompanied Astor, realised just how significant the Observer and Astor had become in that country.
I took him to Vilakazi Street in Soweto to meet Winnie Mandela, who was in the home, in the original Mandela Matchbox home. I think that the law textbooks that David got to Mr. Mandela are still on the shelf there. And Winnie Mandela came out, and I was about to say, Winnie, this is David Astor, and she just threw her arms around him and kissed him. They'd never met, but that's how much he had meant to the family.
That very first encounter, I was very comfortable with him. He had this soft smile and so warm. He had a very warm personality.
I mean, imagine South Africa's history if Nelson Mandela and his fellow trialists had been hanged at that time. The fact that the Observer relentlessly every Sunday was publishing front page I've no doubt, influenced the wiser people within the cabinet at that time to say, wow, this could be really, really bad international publicity.
Nelson Mandela actually said, if it had not been for David Astor in the Observer, Oliver Tambo and I would have hanged.
We continue to this day to think very affectionately of the London Observer from those days, you know, and it has always remained a very special newspaper, particularly for people like myself.